Let's keep working with this idea of remapping. And in this case, we're going to grab information from an image. An image has all sorts of information that we can grab. The image sampler component, which we haven't looked too much at, is going to be what helps us to do this. We can actually grab the red, green, or blue color channels from the image. We could also grab, for example, the brightness. And that's what I've done in this example. We're going to do an exercise is we're actually going to grab the brightness from an image and remap that, and that's going to become the radius for some circles. In this case, where I have bright pixels, I have small circles, and where I have dark pixels, I have bigger circles. I also filter this image, so I'm removing some of the smallest circles, and I give it the color from the image itself. Let's take a look how we do this. Let's start a new file. All this is going to be driven by params input image sampler. We could either bring the image sampler down and give it an image by double clicking and going to the file path, but actually what I'm going to do is show you another way. You can just drag the image from a folder onto the canvas. It'll automatically instantiate the image sampler. Let's do it this way. If we double click it, we have this image sampler settings dialog, which shows us something interesting. Notice here, when we see the image, that we go from 0 to 1 in width and 0 to 1 in height. The X domain and the Y domain are 0 to 1. We could also make this the pixel dimensions, for example, but let's continue to work with this in a simple 0 to 1 domain. That means that if I want to get the information from the pixel at the very center of this image, I'd have to sample it at 0.5, 0.5. The actual data that you plug into the image sampler are two-dimensional points. Let's leave that there, say OK. I'm going to go to Vector, Point, Construct Point. If we plug in 0.5 in X and Y, let's see what we get. I'll double click, quotation, 0.5. I'll plug this into X and into Y. I'm going to go to Params, Input, Panel, and I get some reddish color, RGB. If I actually right-click it, go to Filter, and change this to Value, I'm going to get the value from 0 to 1 of that pixel in the center. So it's somewhere in the middle. Let's go back here, Filter, and just use Color. You'll notice that in the filter, you have all sorts of other things. You could get the transparency if it's a PNG, for example. You could get the different channels, or you can get the hue, saturation, or brightness. The settings that you can access by right-clicking or by double-clicking are the same. They're just presented to you in a different manner. We don't just want one point. We want actually to get as many points on this as possible. What I'm going to do is, instead of just using one point, we'll make a point grid. Let's delete this. Let's go to Sets. This time we'll go to Sequence, Range. The range is going to go from 0 to 1 because we have 0 to 1 in our width and 0 to 1 in our height. I'm going to plug this into X and into Y. Now, if we actually zoom in very close between 0 and 1 in Rhino, we see that we have our diagonal grid of points. Just to test if this is working, let's go ahead and apply the colors that we're getting from the image sampler onto the points. I'll go to Display, Preview, and Custom Preview. I'll plug in the points to G and the resulting colors into S. So it seems like we're getting some colors. In the corner up here, it's pretty dark, and in the other corner down here, it's pretty bright, so it seems like something's working. I actually want a grid of colors. So let's go ahead and here in the construct point, let's right-click on X, and actually we'll graft that input. And there we go. Now we have a grid of points, so we're going to get back all sorts of colors for this. Let's increase the resolution here. So for example, in N, let's go ahead and plug in maybe just a value for 100. We could, of course, plug in a slider eventually, so it would look something like this if I double-clicked and I said 0 to 100 and increased the slider. As we increase this, we're going to actually see the image come into focus. Now it's points, so it's kind of rendering it a little bit strange. In this case, I want this image to be a little bit bigger, not just 1 unit by 1 unit. What I'm going to actually do is create another grid of points. So I'm actually going to select all of this and copy it. Now this grid of points has the same number of points, but it's just going to be in a different domain. Instead of from 0 to 1 here, we'll actually connect our panel. And this grid now goes from 0 to 100 and 0 to 100 units. And we have all of our points here. Let me continue here. We have our sampling grid, which goes from 0 to 1, and we have our physical dimensions of our object eventually here, which goes from 0 to 100. So it's 100 units square. Now what I wanted to do is place some circles here, and eventually use the brightness of the image to change the size of those circles. Right now, I actually want to keep the colors around because I'll use that later, but I'm going to copy the image sampler. I'm going to double click it, and I'm going to change the channel to color brightness. And I'll say OK. Notice that it changes to grayscale. So now we're just getting the grayscale brightness value, and we can make these smaller, even though they're nice to look at. Let's make them smaller so that they don't take up so much of the space here. Now we have brightness values that go from 0 to 1. And we can actually go here to curve, primitive, and circle, and connect our points and connect our brightness values. Already, if we zoom out and maybe turn off our points, we're starting to see the results of this. And we can start to make out the leaves of this image. But as you can notice, the circles are crossing, and maybe I don't want that. Maybe again, I want to limit, so I have a maximum size for the circle and I have a minimum size. In our case, the circles are spaced out on a 1-unit grid because I have 100 elements and I have a dimension of 100 units in each side. So our maximum should be maybe like 0.5, and our minimum should be zero point 0.1 or something. Let's go ahead and remap those values. I'm going to go to Maths, Domain, and Remap Numbers. I'll remap the numbers from the brightness set image sampler. The source domain is already from 0 to 1. Let's change the brightness and create a target domain that goes from 0 to 0.5. I don't want circles that are just 0, so let's go ahead and make that bottom part of the domain 0.1. Let's plug this into the radius now. Look at that. Now we have a situation where the circles aren't going to cross. At most, they'll touch if you have 2 pixels that are very bright. What if I wanted to flip the relationship so that all of these brighter areas had smaller circles? Well, you know that all we need to do now is just flip this. So instead of 0.1 to 0.5, we can say 0.5 to 0.1 to 0. Look at that. Now you have very small circles where you have brightness and bigger circles where you have darkness. Let me turn off the Rhino grid here so we can see all that. And that's looking quite nice. The final thing we can do here is to attribute some colors to these circles. Let me just actually take the colors from here. Instead of plugging them into the points, let's plug our circles into G. I'm going to turn off the preview of our circles, and there we go. So we can use the colors to eventually paint our circles, but really we're using the brightness to change the size of the radius of the circles. And again, that's something that we can control very easily by using remap numbers.